This time on the Cameron Journal podcast, I'm doing an interview with Quinn Cochran. He is a fascinating writer from Colorado. He actually lives near where I went to high school / grew up. Super weird. It's not on the podcast. We talked about it beforehand, but that was a very interesting experience. Anyway, we're talking about historical fiction as a genre this time. I'm working on a historical fiction project that will be out in the future, and I wanted to pick his brain on the ins and outs of historical fiction, how it all works, his creative process, what tools he uses, all this sort of thing. It's a fascinating podcast. We get into his life and his background. He also builds cell phone towers as a day job. So it's pretty cool. He's a really cool guy. It's a great conversation. Join me on the Cameron Journal podcast with Quinn Kayser-Cochran and historical fiction. Let's go. This is the Cameron Journal podcast. It's a place where we talk about important things. It's a place where we bring a little slice of the news to you. It's a place where we do important things, have important conversations. It's also things that I like to talk about. My name is Cameron Cowan, and this is the Cameron Journal podcast. This week on the Cameron Journal podcast, we are happy to welcome Quinn Kayser-Cochran. He writes historical fiction, and we're going to talk about historical fiction and writing and learn about historical fiction because my MFA project is historical fiction. So I'm going to educate myself on the genre. You're going to come along for the ride. It's going to be fantastic. Welcome, Quinn. How are you?
I'm well, Cameron. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you. So why don't you get us into this by letting us know your background, some of your work, what have you published, how did you get into writing? Bring us up to speed on your life.
Well, yeah, in 30 seconds or less, you bet. Background is, so I have a day job. I build cell phone towers. I was an English major in college, though, and wrote a lot, have written a lot over the years. Had published one book previously in 2012. Also historical fiction. That one kind of came about because I had a class in college, and the professor, I was in school back east, and the professor said, you have no accent. I said, oh, okay. And he said, well, where are you from? And I said, Denver. And he said, I get it. And this was a Civil War class. So he said, what do you know about Glorietta? And I said, I don't know what you just said. And he said, well, look it up. Whatever the topic was that you were supposed to write about, forget that, skip it. Write about Glorietta instead. So I ended up doing a paper on the Confederate invasion of New Mexico during the Civil War. And, graduated, went on and did other things. And years later, a friend who was in TV and film production said, you should write a screenplay. And I said, I would have no idea what to write about. They said, well, pick a topic that you enjoyed in college, something that you feel fairly well versed in, and just dive in. And so that paper was the basis for my first novel. My interest is more in Western mining history, though, so that is sort of the basis for the second book. It's actually a labor conflict. I have a PTSD veteran of the Philippine War, takes work as a company detective for a corrupt company on the verge of a labor war with its employees, 1907 Nevada, and our protagonist slowly realizes he's on the wrong side of a vicious struggle for control of the district, and runs afoul of his boss, and basically needs to make nice with the folks in the union that he's been antagonizing for years and years. So a bit of a historical thriller, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's all. That's that the history of all that with mining and labor issues in the West is all fascinating. Absolutely fascinating.
It is.
Yeah. And it's kind of when people talk about that, it's kind of a very untold story.
It
Because a lot of
is.
people talk about, the big strikes during the Depression in the East in the 1930s, not realizing it was oftentimes miners out west that were the vanguards of the labor movement in this country.
Yes.
A lot of those mining strikes predate the big factory strikes by decades.
Yeah, they did. Starting with kind of the steel strikes in the late 1800s, the Pullman Porter strikes on the railroads. It's all sort of a long continuum.
The coal strike where Teddy Roosevelt almost nationalized the entire coal industry.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Or at least threatened to do it to get the coal barons to come to terms with their labor force.
Yeah.
But that all, that really, without all that hard work, you wouldn't have gotten the great labor reforms of the Depression without all that decades of work ahead of time.
Right. I have a college friend who writes a lot about, he and I had a sort of the direction it's shaping this one. There's a ton of, half the fun of writing historical fiction is researching. And, that involved, I talked to a couple of, you'd say eminent in their field, historians who, sent me one direction or another and said, "Hey, have you considered this? Did you think about read this book?" One is a guy named Peter Cole, actually somebody I went to college with. He sent me one direction. I had a friend who's actually a colonel in the Marine Corps. Sent me we had another conversation. He sent me off in pursuit of other materials. A couple other people that had written, but I contacted the authors of some of the books I had read for research, and they were very gracious with their time, answering my questions and pointing out additional resources. So, if you don't like research, don't write historical fiction. I guess that's the.
Well, that was one of the things I was most curious about. I wanted to understand your process of when you're working on something in the historical fiction space. What is your process to get ready to write about it and make that world come alive?
Oh, the process is a little haphazard for me. I sort of outlined generally what I had thought would be the story, and then went into my primary documents, and then that sort of leads to additional information. Certain storylines had to be either expanded or eliminated on the basis of additional research. So it's kind of an evolving process. Honestly, it's almost like coming up with your thesis again in college. You're like, well, here's what I'm going to write about, but the research may not necessarily lead from point A to point B by the time you're finished. You may find yourself several degrees off course from where you started, and it just kind of is what it is. I mean, you could, I don't know. There's an author named it was Ivan Doig, and he wrote Dancing at the Rascal Fair, Work Song, and a handful of other well-received books. He was a journalist up in Butte, Montana. And honestly, I read his Work Song, which is about labor relations in Montana, in mines around Butte, the copper mines, and kind of the relation of miners to the Anaconda Corporation. And I wrote Widowmaker, my book, almost in response to Work Song. I had read a whole bunch of sources that painted the ferocity of the struggle between unions and the mine owners and mining companies is a lot more grim, a lot more dire than he did. I think I read his book, and he has people throwing rocks at the guards and stuff. I'm like, that's not what I read. I read, one. I had an informant, I guess you will. He sort of ended up working both sides for both Anaconda and the labor union. He was basically beaten, and they tied him to the bumper of a car and dragged him down the road until he died, and then hung his body from a bridge as a warning to other miners in the union. And so reading Mr. Doig's book, which seemed kind of, I don't know. It just seemed it wasn't mean enough, I guess. So I ended up.
Yeah. I mean, throwing rocks seems rather sedate compared to murder by dragging. I was just curious about kind of how you start and how you begin, because I start all of my projects with a Pinterest mood board. I go onto Pinterest and I gather all the visuals that I want.
Yep.
Clothes, locations, structures, furniture, landscapes, so on and such forth. All of it. And I refer back from time my mindset of what to feel like, what I want to have happen, and what I want to go on. Hang on one moment. I'm having an internet issue.
Sure, no
and
problem.
It's going to affect the recording.
Okay.
And we may have to reconnect if...
No problem.
No.
Your voice went slightly robotic for a second, but you're back.
Yes, well, I've switched to data and not internet. Something's gone wrong with the Wi-Fi.
Got it.
We're living in downtown Seattle. We have really the internet service down here leaves a lot to be desired.
Yeah.
My building only has CenturyLink, and it's lately it's not been that great, and it better not be because of it's raining outside, because it does that 9 months of the year.
Yeah, right. Right.
But
of all places for
I like to get. I know. It's like, you can't tell me it's because it rained. It does that all the time.
Right.
If we stopped for rain, we would never do anything here. So yes. So anyway, I like to start with that because it gets my mind set for the visuals of what I want to do and what I want this world to look like. So when it comes to creating 1907 Nevada, what do you do? What do you look for? What do you read so it feels like we're right there?
Right.
In 1907 Nevada.
Well, I travel a lot, so I spent in the course of my other day job, real job, whatever you want to call it. I've spent quite a bit of time in the rural portions of Nevada, and so I visited the setting of my book. I've been to other towns, Tonopah, Goldfield. I tend to keep journals as I travel too. I hear what you're saying about I am late to discovering mood boards on Pinterest. I actually came up with one for marketing because in the course of querying and pitching this to agents and whatnot, I had a lot of feedback that didn't. It's clear people weren't getting the idea. They're like, well, where is it set? It's set in Nevada, so it's a Western. I'm like, well, it's in the West, but it's not cowboys and Indians. And so,
yes.
I put the mood board together for marketing as much as anything after the fact. I think, I did tons and tons of reading, and tons of travel, literally years worth. I write very slowly, so it's taken me about 6 non-contiguous years to write this second book. It took 8 for the first, so my pace is accelerating. That's exciting. I figure I have at least 2 more books in me before I die, so that's good. I do a lot of I pick up not only reading material, but a lot of photographic. I go to photo archives. University of Nevada, Reno has a tremendous photo archive online of mining camps and just kind of the day-to-day, not only the mines and mining itself, but the towns, the transportation, the entertainment, town dances, social clubs out there. So there's a lot of places you can look for inspiration, I would think.
Yeah.
It all sort of depends on, I had done so much reading before I started writing this book that I almost feel like I had a good handle on where to go and how to make it sound right, and then supplemented it along the way with lots of other types of research, the photo archives and the travel and whatnot.
Yeah, I started doing the boards for marketing purposes as well because I figured it would be a helpful thing to do in the future, and then it just became part of the process because I need that visual anchor. How I write, I like to make it seem like you're standing in a corner. On the other side of the room watching the drama go on. I get that detailed in terms of I will describe how fabric falls on a skirt. I will describe a chair, all this sort of thing. And so if I'm doing a scene in the car, I want it to seem like you're sitting in the back seat watching it happen in front of you. And so I need that whole visual aesthetic. I need that whole thing. And so the project I'm going to do for my MFA is called the Sweetgrass Saga, and it's about a Southern family in Mississippi on a plantation and the lives of them and their children. And it's loosely, I'm Black, and it's loosely based on the plantation that my family left after the war, and called Bowling Green. And so I was just working on that mood board the other day. And so it's like, it's like I want clothes, I want furniture, I want paintings, I want houses and trees and all this sort of thing. And then I also kind of want horrors of slavery because it's in Downton Abbey style. So we see the lives of the family and we also see the lives of their slaves sort of thing. Yeah, and so it's kind of like an upstairs, downstairs, but it's the South, so it's inside, outside, because base, sort of thing. But it's kind of like big house, slave quarters sort of thing, and and so it's like I need all of that stuff. Like I need to look at a slave cabin for 4 hours to describe it properly, like all that sort of thing. So I was very curious as to how you kind of make those worlds come alive, because the first book I wrote took place in the early 2000s, which I obviously lived through. So I didn't really have to stretch myself on the aesthetic. And then I did a short story called Windswept Waste that takes place in the 1960s. You'll know this because it's in Colorado. It's based about Rocky Flats.
Yeah.
And all that shit fuckery. And so this guy gets a job at Rocky Flats, sort of thing. And then when they had a small fire, plutonium fire,
as you do,
in 1969, a small plutonium fire in 1969. Yes, and I kind of the story is the lead up to that plutonium fire and him being involved with it. So it's all welding and nuclear weapons and Cold War and glove boxes and all this sort of thing. And so that was my first time where I had to really kind of stretch and be like, how do I create Arvada in the 1960s? Like, So it's kind of so I'm online being like, what was the popular shopping mall? What roads did not exist?
Right.
I called my mom. What was this? What I'm like, oh, a primary source. Hi, mom. Sort of thing. And to kind of try to create Denver, west of Denver, Arvada in the 1960s. And so that was my chief thing I wanted to know about you, kind of how, in historical fiction, how do I make 1850 Mississippi real? So it seems you're practically standing on the porch having iced tea.
I can see.
As everything
that's the fun of historical fiction is world building. I see a lot of writers on Twitter quite anxious about their word count and is 80,000 words too long? I'm like, I'm just getting started, and you get a little bit of latitude as a historical fiction writer because there's world building involved, not unlike science fiction and fantasy, where they're literally creating a world from scratch. You can't just launch into why something is without explaining how the things are around it. Of course, you have to. The trick is balancing. You don't want to do info dump type writing, so of course you have to weave those little details in. Just because the slant of light across the wood surface and you just have to evoke mood and setting with just lots of little details throughout. One of the things was funny, it even pertains to language, like you were saying, when you were writing about Arvada in the 50s, no Boulder Turnpike, you wouldn't have, and if you'd written about your protagonist. So if you,
Indiana didn't go through yet. It stopped almost right after Rocky Flats. That's why it was basically a one way in, one way out sort of place. That it didn't go all the way up to Boulder like it does now. That's a very treacherous drive. But
you're constantly looking for anachronisms. One of the just the phrase, well, this guy, just the term guy, as I understand it, didn't get used the way we do now until I think Noel Coward was the first person to use it in the 20s in a place. So back then it was like, well, what? So I had to do a quick search and replace when I read that somewhere. I'm like, man, I do say, well, this guy, that guy, you can't even have verbal or literary anachronisms. So I had to look at
No, I write a 1925 murder mystery series, the IG Farmer mysteries, and I've had to get really good at 1920 slang and make sure to not use any of our slang so it seems real. And that's I have to be in a certain place to work on IG Farm, and I put on par on Stellar. I
had a lot of Scott Joplin playing in the background, just just some ragtime piano going sometimes when I was editing. So,
yes, yes, absolutely, yeah. My second book, I'd done so much research about the 50s and 60s. My second book is called A Plains Girl, and it's almost done. And
very nice.
It's set in 1950s Eastern Colorado.
Sure, sure, yeah.
Yeah, which is easy for me to do because I used to live out there. So that was not a far stretch. And I'd gotten so into that world, I felt comfortable doing more in it. But this book takes place over decades, so it's in the 50s into the 60s, and then we jump forward to 1974, and then we jump forward again to the 1990s. And it's a very, and it kind of leads into the next question of, I am very focused on giving a sense of time. And I'm curious as to how you do this. Like, for me, to create 1960 in the background of a conversation, I have the Kennedy-Nixon TV debate, first presidential debate on television, to give a sense of time. When I was writing in the 50s, I was kind of like, Okay,
Yeah.
literally on news sites. What was the major headlines of 1954? What significantly happened in 1955? So I can
Right.
weave in
Right.
these world events to give a sense of time, you know. And it's like right, we have to pull in fashion, and we have to pull in the cars, and we have to pull in, are you going to buy a television or not, because most people didn't have one, to kind of create that sense of time. So how do you, in addition to the kind of aesthetic, how do you create that sense of? So
I think pretty much just the same way you mentioned there. You're referencing, the internet is certainly a blessing in that regard. You can type in any date and say what was happening that year, and
Indeed,
your character can reference whatever the news event of the day was. It is. I learned a lot more about the Theodore Roosevelt administration than I did before I started. Certainly, that was a lot of the. There was an excellent book about the assassination of Idaho's governor, a guy named Frank Steunenberg, and the leadership of the Western Federation of Miners was implicated in his murder. He was basically assassinated at his garden gate. It was rigged with explosives, and when he came home one night, it blew his legs off and killed him. And this was all encapsulated in a book called Big Trouble, and it's an enormous book of nonfiction. It's a fascinating story to me because it covers, it's everything. It weaves in everything that was going on in America at the time, and why this this trial in a sparsely populated state out west kind of touched on all the hot button issues that were affecting all of America at the time. It was impossibly remote. It's fascinating. There was no FBI back then, so it was all private investigators. And the governor of Idaho, the succeeding governor of Idaho, hired various detective agencies, the Pinkertons, the Thiels, and some others. They basically kidnapped the leadership of the Western Federation of Miners, Bill Haywood, Charlie Moyer, and they basically put him on a train and drove the train went nonstop across Wyoming and Utah up to Idaho before their families even had found that they'd been kidnapped from Denver. And, this went to the Supreme Court. Is this legal? And back then, it's just fascinating to me seeing how things at the time sort of relate to issues we still see in terms of, labor relations, kind of a plutocratic class that sort of thinks the rules don't apply to them. And then the courts, of course, doing their bidding. So it's fun it's just fascinating. The Philippine War, the Philippine-American War, which was sort of the Asian portion of the Spanish-American War, was highly, there's certainly differences, but it's pretty analogous to Vietnam, some 60 years later, and 70 years later, it's just amazing. You see these themes and patterns repeating themselves through history. So, you just kind of know I kind of got off your original question of time, setting a course of time, but having a timeline of what's going on is helpful, and you can, depending on how you frame your story, of course, you can reference those things fairly regularly, or just a little bit to set the mood, and then the story, could function more or less independently without constant reference to what's going on. But it's.
Yeah. I'm also curious about tools. I recently made the switch to Scrivener, and I'm in love. After years and years of saying you don't need to buy expensive tools, all of this is pointless, all this sort of thing.
Sadly, just Microsoft Word. And then occasionally Excel as an easy spreadsheet for doing timeline. I tried Scrivener once, and I think because I was mid-project, it was too difficult to change horses midstream, and I gave up on it. I probably need to go back and give it another try. I keep hearing, I've heard nothing but good things about it. I don't know anyone who's used it who's unhappy with it. I think I just didn't have the patience at the time to give it a try. But right,
there's definitely a steep learning curve. And I haven't even deleted the tutorial file.
What do you like about it? Especially as compared to
6 months?
Other programs that writers might be familiar with.
Yeah, I'll admit I didn't kind of try out a bunch of writers' tools before I tried Scrivener. So here's how I used to write. Here's how my first novel was put together. I would I would have a notebook in Evernote, because Evernote is my life. My life exists in Evernote. If I ever lose my password, I'm totally screwed. And so I would have a notebook in Evernote, and I would write chapters and scenes and all this type of thing. And then I would have what I called gluification, where I would go through Evernote and I would painstakingly glue all the parts that I had in Evernote together into all the chapters, all this type of thing. I would have a huge master outline, and I would go through and make sure that chapter 1, X, Y, and Z is supposed to happen, and that over there on the other side, X, Y, and Z had happened, and all that sort of thing. And I would kind of glue the whole project together. And then from Microsoft Word, it would then go to edit. And when I first started, I don't do it anymore, but I used to write longhand. So what would happen is I would write in a notebook, it would get transcribed into Evernote, from Evernote to Word, from Word to InDesign, InDesign to paper, was kind of the full arc of a project. That's kind of how I used to do it. And it was frustrating because there was a lot of flipping screens back and forth, going between notes, because I couldn't have outline and draft side by side in Evernote. So I would sometimes copy and paste the passage of the outline that I was working on to the top of the document that I was working on, so I could just scroll up, sort of thing. It was very manual and very plodding. Scrivener is wonderful because you can have both your outline and your draft side by side. That's the thing I love the most. For my fantasy project that has 4 outlines that collapse into 2, has 4 storylines that eventually collapse into 2, you can color code the outline so you know which storyline you're in. That's incredibly helpful and incredibly easy to do. I'm doing a nonfiction book, and Scrivener is incredibly helpful at keeping track of research sources. You can view PDFs.
They may be contacting you,
surely. To become an ad for Scrivener, and they're not paying for it.
Fantastic.
I know. Like next week, Cameron Journal Podcast brought to you by Scrivener. So all those are there is a learning curve, and you do have to sit down and figure stuff out, try stuff out, break stuff, all this type of thing. But once you kind of get it going, watch a couple YouTube videos, all that type of thing, it makes it so much easier. The only thing I miss is being able to write on my phone. There was a lot of times where I would have Evernote on my phone, and I like to write on my phone in bed sometimes. And I would do that. And with Scrivener, the mobile app, you have to pay separately for it. And they don't really sync together, so I haven't people are not huge fans of the mobile app, so I have not purchased. So I do miss writing in bed at night. But in terms of keeping track of storylines, outlines, drafts, all that type of thing, it can't.
Yeah,
but I'm not surprised that you.
I feel like I need to
Word. That's what most people
break myself of break old habits. But maybe here with the work, I'm still only doing research and outlining in one sample chapter for book 3. So this is probably as good a time as any to learn some new tricks.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. If you have the inclination before you launch into the next project, would be a good time to dive in. I was just curious because sometimes people have really interesting programs or tools or whatever have you that they use that really
right. Alas, I am
are just very interesting to hear about what they use and why and all that sort of thing. So
stuck with old tech and. Scratching my head when files disappear, as they do from time to time. That's back up your work.
Yes, that's yes, always backups and saves, and I have my entire laptop backed up in 2 places, so I don't lose it. There's a physical hard drive backup, and everything goes to Google Drive.
You will be much happier having done so, I think.
In 2 places. Yes, absolutely. Now, in terms of process, were you ever since you are in historical fiction, have you ever been
pretty much just keyboard? From time to time, situationally, just
to the keyboard.
I don't know. Sometimes when I'm traveling, it makes more sense to do longhand. Short overnight for work. Just no point in setting up and a big production. So I'll just work longhand and then transcribe those notes more or less as you were doing with your first. But I don't. I have a couple of old. I have a Royal and an under. Just old typewriters that I've inherited from family members, and they're pretty much just decor. I actually went on a typewriting accessories store on Etsy one time and got the inked ribbon and apparently the typewriter needs more rehab before that'll work. All it did was the reels wouldn't spin, and I just ended up pounding a hole through the same patch of ribbon and cutting it in half. So I gave it a very weak college try and gave up, went right back to the keyboard.
Yeah, I have a dear friend who I actually should have on the podcast. His process is complicated. He writes longhand first, then he types it up on a typewriter, and then he puts it into the computer.
Mm-hmm.
And it was we were at a writing residency together in Tennessee, and I went into his studio, and I'm just kind of like, oh my God, John, this is too much. Like, I heard at the time it takes for you to finish anything. And there he was. He had his notebooks out, his typewriter there, his laptop off to one side. Like, that's, and it was just, and I was amazed at how many, because I was in a writing group where actually someone yelled at me for writing longhand. Like, people could hear, like, for writing longhand, and like told me that I had to type, and that because of that, I moved to an all digital process. I was a big typewriter person. I've owned a dozen typewriters in my life, and I sometimes I don't miss transcribing longhand. I miss that feeling, that process, but I don't miss the extra time, and I go back to Scrivener. I'm kind of like, it would be so nice to be sitting in a coffee shop with a notebook, and then I'm like, but then you have to spend 4 hours transcribing it all.
As much time as I spend rewriting during editing, I may as well do as your friend does and
it's just
type it out. entirely. I don't know. Maybe that gives you a better sense of, sometimes you can get through your 500th round of edits and you're like, how did this particular phrase live as long as it did? It's terrible.
Well, that's basically his different writing methodology is his editorial process. And I used to do that too when I wrote longhand.
Right.
What got onto the computer was different than what was in the notebook, because I would edit as I would go along and be like, oh, this doesn't work, or oh, this is fantastic, or this actually really belongs up here. Like, I would kind of live edit as I was, which is why it was so time consuming, live edit as I was transcribing. And that's basically what he does. Each step in his process is another editorial process. So by the time he gets to his laptop, the result is quite good. Whereas now I do it all digitally, and then I sit down and read it on a screen, or read it on my iPad, or in the case of a novel, and here's what's sad, I will email the whole thing to my UPS store, and I will make them print it out and send it to me. Right. And so some nice man from UPS will then deliver a ream of paper. And then I'll sit down and
if you're looking for criticism, you've come to the wrong place, because I see nothing wrong with that. I think whatever process works and gets a finished, whatever gets you to the finish line is the correct process for you. Some of us sprint across the finish line, others limp, but anyone who gets there has done it right,
Yeah. Yeah. Is there anything you do to get in the mood to write or get in that creative place or whatever have you? Do you have any weird rituals?
Yeah. That's usually after I've written and I
Jack and
meant the quality of what I've just done. No. Actually, it's kind of funny. I had sort of I used to do, I still do, visual arts, drawing and painting. And I found once we had kids, I don't know what it is about me, but I need to do artwork. I need a minimum of 4 uninterrupted hours. By the time I get going, it's just kind of getting the flow at some point in hour 1. And then that gives you a couple hours of productivity. And then, of course, you got to clean up and all that other stuff. So once my wife and I had kids, there's no such thing as 4 uninterrupted hours. It just doesn't happen. Whereas with writing, I can just sit down and I can write for 10 minutes, and then a kid, scrapes their knee or needs a ride to practice or something, and then I can jump up and do that, and then return to writing, kind of sit down and reinsert myself right back into where I was. So writing actually became more of a creative outlet as I've into parenthood anyway. So yeah.
Yeah. I to me that is a miracle, because the thing you had with visual arts, I have that with writing.
Right.
For me to write creatively, effectively, I need 4 to 6 hours. That's why I write in the middle of the night. That's why I don't get up till 11 o'clock or noon, because then the phone doesn't ring and the emails don't come in. And I write in the middle of the night. I need literally 4 to 6 hours where I can just exist in my project and just sort of do that and be that. And I'm amazed at people who can.
I don't know how it is,
down
but
and jump back in and get interrupted and then come back and be right in the same place. My brain does not work that way. Yeah, no, it's quite remarkable, because my brain does not work that way at all. I can do that if I'm writing a blog post, if I'm writing or if I'm doing the news, because I'm a journalist, as well. And if I'm writing the news, I can do that. I can be kind of like, oh yes, the government has done something terrible this week. And then I can get up and go do something or take a call, whatever. I can come back, pick up the thread and be like, and that's why you should care about it. Like all this sort of thing. But when it comes to creative, I have to really kind of be aligned.
They will,
it's a good thing I don't have kids, and I'm not planning on any, because I would not have.
Yeah,
would not write any
I
books until
really
they were
don't
in
know why
college.
that is.
Like,
It does. It does.
sort
It
of
feels
thing. Like, yeah.
weird, I guess, in terms of, I hear more people say exactly what you have just said about writing. I somehow I am just the opposite, and I don't know why that is. I really don't.
Yeah.
But I have a freshman in high school and a
How old are your
fifth grader.
children?
So I have got years of interruptions ahead of me.
Oh, very nice. Very nice.
Yeah, and late too. My wife and I were married for 11 years
your
before
so
we
far
had
apart.
kids. So we were
absolutely, yeah.
kind of the old folks at the PTO meetings, but
Yeah, no, I had dear friends years ago who were kind of in the same boat. They didn't necessarily intend on having children, and then their daughter came along, and they were so into that they decided to have their son, but they were in like their late 30s when that happened. So they're like 41 showing up to first grade. Everyone else is in their 20s, sort of thing. And they were married for 10 years.
I feel like I'm more patient as more patient than I would have been as a parent in my 20s, but I'm exhausted and I can't keep up with him. So, what are you gonna do?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a trade-off. It's a trade-off.
Yeah, I've enjoyed this, Cameron. Thank you for...
this has been absolutely delightful, just sitting here and talking and almost forgetting that we're supposed to be doing a podcast.
This opportunity. Let me know. I'm interested to pick up more of your work and see how things turn out with your projects.
Of course. Well, thank you for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast. And now's a great time for plugs if you have websites.
Oh, sure. Let's see. QuinnKayser-Cochran.com, all run together. It is QuinnKayser-Cochran at...
We'll put it in the show notes, dear listener.
Yeah, there you go. I'm on Twitter at Q Kayser-Cochran, and then I don't know what I am in Pinterest and Instagram. I actually enlisted my team to help me spice up my Instagram offerings, so we'll see what I can find there.
Yeah. Twitter is good enough. Twitter's a great way. Right, Twitter is made for writers, so people should definitely visit you at both locations. But like I said, thank you for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast.
Cameron, thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter. And we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.